Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome everyone to this Teams live event called Visibility Matters, Representation of Lesbian Communities at Archives and Beyond, a panel discussion. My name is Jackie Gahagan. I am the founder and project lead for the Nova Scotia LGBT Seniors Archive, as well as the Lesbian Oral History Project, and I will serve as a moderator for today's panel discussion. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that both Dalhousie University and Mount St. Vincent University are located in the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, and that we are all treaty people. Now, by way of background, this Teams event stems from the Nova Scotia Department of Seniors Age-Friendly Communities grant funding that we received in 2019 to establish the first community-facing archival collection at the Killam Library at Dalhousie University, which focuses on older LGBT Nova Scotians and their various contributions to life in this province. This funding application was a community collaboration between the Elderberries, NSRAP, Dalhousie University, and the Halifax Public Library. The impetus behind founding the Nova Scotia LGBT Seniors Archive emerged in part in response to the 2017 apology from the Prime Minister of Canada for the 4 decades-long purge of LGBT Canadians, specifically from the military, the RCMP, and the civil service. It's important to note that all Canadians were impacted by government's inaction, especially LGBT-specific actions regarding human rights. So whether or not individuals from our communities were employed by the Canadian government at that time, we were all impacted by government inaction. The hard-fought human rights protections that we now have in place are thanks to the tenacity and relentless efforts of our LGBT community members, including those in Nova Scotia. And it's important to note that many of our older LGBT populations are the keepers of this historical information and are now in their senior years. Given this, the purpose of our collaborative project was to develop a digitized, publicly accessible archive of the various contributions made by diverse populations of the LGBT communities across Nova Scotia. More recently, in 2021, our team applied for and received funding from the Nova Scotia Communities, Culture and Heritage Strategic Development Initiative to create the Lesbian Oral History Project. The Lesbian Oral History Project is aimed at further amplifying the lives of older lesbians in Nova Scotia through the collection, transcription, digitization of these stories to ensure this rich and yet oftentimes overlooked history is not lost. The archival materials contributed to the Lesbian Oral History Project will be shared through the Nova Scotia LGBT Seniors Archive. Today's panel discussion recognizes with gratitude the important contributions of lesbians in Nova Scotia as we mark International Lesbian Visibility Day 2022. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to each of our panel members joining us today. I would also like to thank those who have donated to the NS LGBT Seniors Archive and/or contributed their story to the Lesbian Oral History Project. Please know your story matters. And finally, a big heartfelt thank you to the absolutely wonderful production team from Dalhousie University who made this event possible. Thank you to Marlo, Jolene, Courtney, Nicole, Phil, and Guy. And just a few housekeeping items before we get started. To use live captions, go to Settings, from your video controls, select Captions, Subtitles. And in terms of the chat box, please use this to ask questions during the Q&A session, which will take place immediately following the panel. And please try to direct your question to a specific panelist where possible. I'll invite each speaker to talk about the importance of lesbian visibility and how such collections can assist with this. But first, let me briefly introduce each of our panelists now. Our first panelist is Rachel Moore. Rachel Moore, she, her, is a queer activist and information manager residing in Halifax. As a former research assistant to the Nova Scotia LGBT Seniors Archive, Rachel was instrumental in the development of the archive's holdings and guiding documents, including the creation of LGBT duplicate materials collection and the Lesbian Oral Histories collection. Rachel received her Master's of Library and Information Studies from Dalhousie University School of Information Management in May 2021. During her time at SIM, Rachel served as programming co-chair and later conference co-chair for the Information Without Borders conference, in recognition of which she was awarded the 2021 SIM Leadership Award. She is currently the programming coordinator with Women in Film and Television Atlantic. Welcome, Rachel. Anne Bishop. Anne Bishop made her living teaching adult education. She's worked toward justice in a number of areas for over 50 years, including co-chairing Lesbian and Gay Rights Nova Scotia, the organization that coordinated the lobby to include sexual orientation in the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act. She is the author or co-author of 7 nonfiction books and 2 novels. She and her partner are in the process of retiring from their small farm where they raise sheep, chickens, veggies, berries, and tree fruit. They contributed to the Lesbian and Gay Rights Nova Scotia papers and to the LGBT Seniors Archive and took part in the Lesbian Oral History Project. Thank you, Anne, for being here. Denise Rodriguez, they practices librarianship at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Among her responsibilities are coordinating e-learning and library research services, supporting programs in the social sciences, including the Queer Studies minor, and teaching a credit-bearing online information literacy course. Meredith Batt, them, is originally from Sackville, Moncton, New Brunswick, and graduated with a BA in history from University of Moncton. They work as an archivist at the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick and are the president of the Queer Heritage Initiative of New Brunswick, an archival initiative which collects the history of 2S LGBTQA+ populations from across the province. Their writing has appeared in Extra Magazine, Active History, and the Canadian Historical Review. When they aren't busy writing, they can be found biking the trails of Fredericton or paddling a kayak on Wostokic River. And our final panelist is Eleanor Crosby. Eleanor, them, is a gender-queer librarian in Halifax, Nova Scotia. They hold a BFA in Fine Arts from NASCAD University and an MLIS from Dalhousie University School of Information Management, and currently work as a manager, programming and community engagement with Halifax Public Libraries. Having successfully advocated for the creation of a 2S LGBTQI+ regional portfolio, they lead a team of colleagues to create capacity to better serve the queer community within and without library through programming, information sharing, and training. They're also the newcomer services portfolio holder, and they work regionally with their interests, including making libraries accessible to people of every size, ability, culture, and background. Okay, let's get started with our first panelist. That would be Rachel Moore. So over to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. So my name is Rachel Moore, and until very recently, I was a research assistant with the Nova Scotia LGBT Seniors Archive. I am currently wrapping up work on the Archive's Lesbian Oral Histories project that Jackie mentioned, and I'm here to talk to you about that today. So just a quick note before I begin that the photos you're going to see on my slides today were chosen because they were either donated by participants of the project or by lesbian identified donors. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the archive before we talk about the Lesbian Oral Histories project. The Nova Scotia LGBT Seniors Archive is part of the Dalhousie University Archives, operating out of the Killam Library in Halifax. It was founded in 2019, and the original funding, as Jackie mentioned, came from the Department of Seniors. As such, the archive was designed as an intergenerational project with the mission to collect, arrange, preserve, and make accessible records of the contributions made by LGBT seniors to the province of Nova Scotia. The archive is meant to support teaching and research related to LGBT seniors at Dalhousie, as well as within the broader community in Nova Scotia and beyond. Next slide, please. So a bit about the purpose behind the Lesbian Oral Histories project. So while we have been really lucky at the archive to collect a significant body of records documenting LGBT groups and causes generally, and gay men's groups and causes more specifically, we have not been as successful in collecting materials specific to other identities. There's a lot of reasons that this might be, but it likely has to do with the LGBT liberation movement's comparative focus on gay men's issues and the relative prominence of gay men's social spaces and organizations when compared to those of other genders. So in order to address this gap within our archival holdings, we applied for funding from the Department of Communities, Culture and Heritage to conduct oral history interviews. So the goal behind these interviews was to increase representation of non-cis male identities in the archive by supplementing physical materials with these oral histories. Collecting these oral histories also has the added benefit of allowing interview subjects to tell their stories in their own way, which is really nice. Next slide, please. So a bit about the collections process. The first thing we did was write the grant application, which I wrote with lots of help from Jackie, and we submitted that in April of last year. And once that was approved, we began trying to locate participants, which ended up being the most challenging part of this process. People are very protective of their personal histories and are understandably wary of cultural heritage institutions due to historic misrepresentation of minority groups. So our biggest hurdle was finding people who wanted to trust us with their stories. Adding difficulty to that is that outside of contacting LGBT seniors groups like the Elderberries, which are one of our partner organizations, it's difficult to locate pockets of LGBT seniors because they're just people living their lives. There's no directory for us to pull from in order to find these people and contact them for this project. So luckily, many of our participants suggested friends and acquaintances for us to reach out to, and this snowball method is how we found most of our participants. Our project coordinator, Anne Summerhays, was fantastic at turning those leads into interviews, and as participants trickled in, Anne would pair them with one of our volunteers. These were primarily intergenerational pairings with a younger person interviewing a senior participant, not always, but in most of the cases. The benefit of these intergenerational pairings that I noticed going through the transcripts was that it seemed that there was less of an assumed basis of mutual knowledge. So the participants explained the context of their experiences for the interviewers in what might be a more robust way than if there were more of a peer-to-peer relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee. After each interview was completed, it was sent to our transcriptionist, Leah Burton, to be transcribed, and I am now in the process of uploading those transcripts and recordings to the archives catalog. These will be available as born digital objects that will be embedded into the catalog so you can view them online. Next slide, please. So just a bit about our results. Upon completion, the Lesbian Oral Histories Project had a total of 8 volunteer interviewers, 27 participants, and a total of 23 interviews. And this is because we had 4 couples that chose to be interviewed together as opposed to separately. And this resulted in over 20 hours of audio recordings. So for comparison, the archive has 26 fonds and collections in total, and this includes the Lesbian Oral Histories collection. So we have roughly as many interviews in this one collection as we do individual fonds in the archive as a whole, which is really fantastic. And what's also great about these interviews is how different the information contained therein is from the information that can be found within the physical records that already exist in the archive. So these physical records typically document organized actions within the community, and these interviews are very personal. Participants shared a lot about their families, their romantic relationships, their coming out process, their position in the community, how they discovered their sexuality, the way that their sexuality impacted their jobs or their friendships or other relationships. And these are all intangible things that outside of diaries and letters, physical records don't necessarily capture. So we're really grateful to have been trusted with this glimpse into people's lives. The one significant weakness to this project that I did want to address before I finish up is that the project did have a lack of geographic and racial diversity among the participants. And this is largely due to the fact that we were relying on referrals from other participants because we were limited in our scope. So we did try to reach out to community organizations across the province to broaden our reach a little bit with little success. This might be because we were in the middle of a pandemic and travel was not necessarily an option. We didn't have as many options to connect with people within the community as we maybe would have liked to. So if we were to do something like this again, that would be something that we would aim at improving. And my last slide, please. So thank you so much. That's just a bit of a recap on the project. Looking forward to answering any questions that you might have, and I will pass things over to Anne Bishop.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for taking part. I am one of the people who donated to the archives, my partner and myself, and we also participated in one of the oral history interviews. And I was asked to talk about why we did that. And well, besides being a museum and archive nerd generally, I'm quite passionate about the need to reflect on history and how can we do that if we don't have it? And I've actually this winter been thinking particularly about lesbian history because I've been working on a novel set in a lesbian separatist farming cooperative in 1986. There's also a lesbian clergy character in it, and that was the height of the United Church struggle over gay ordination. And that it's interesting to think about because the lesbian separatist co-ops emerged in the late 60s and disappeared in the late 80s. I mean, they're gone now. And why is that? Also, the United Church, which was a crisis at the time, seems very much in the past. And it's amazing to me how much things have changed for lesbians just in my lifetime. When I lost my last job with benefits in 1998, I was given the choice of leaving my pension in the organization or taking it with me as a locked RRSP. And I took it with me because I didn't believe in 1998 that we would get to the point where my partner could inherit my pension. So why has so much changed so fast when it hasn't actually for some other marginalized communities? And what does all of that mean for the change strategies that we pursue in the future? And how can we answer questions like that unless we preserve this history? The other thing I've been doing this winter is going through my family papers. My sister and I had to empty our family home in the summer of 2020, and I brought home multiple boxes of journals and letters and photographs and other papers. And I've been going through them, organizing them, and trying to get them into appropriate archives, which means thinking a lot about the people who've gone before, including my aunt and my great aunt, both of whom lived for more than 40 years in loving partnerships with women. My aunt and her partner, whenever they talked about social events, it was all female names and they all came in pairs. And my great aunt, the last time we visited her, she had been separated from her partner. Her nephew, my cousin, and his wife had established her in a care home that was convenient for them, and her partner was still in the way far northeast of Toronto, and her partner was still in their apartment downtown. They were talking on the telephone 2 or 3 times a day. But in her room, there were only 2 photographs of people. One was her mother, and the other was her partner, dressed in a men's suit and tie and a fedora and carrying a beautiful, jaunty, silver-headed walking stick. So these are women that we tend to think of as our lesbian foremothers. But I'm very aware that that's not how they would have thought of themselves. When I was busy trying to figure out my own identity in my mid-20s, which also sounds pretty out of date now, I used the word lesbian in conversation with my aunt, and she was furious. She hit the roof over it. She told me never ever to use that word in her presence again. And I wouldn't have even thought of trying it on my great aunt. She and I share the same name. And when I lived in Toronto, I used to get her mail sometimes, including mailings from extreme anti-feminist organizations. So this is not their our language is not theirs. They called each other, their partners, friends. Or my aunt and her partner used to refer to each other as great and good friends. And they referred to themselves as career girls or not the marrying kind. The word lesbian, it was not only a terribly risky term in terms of losing jobs and family, but for them, it still had its 1920s connotations. You know, evil, godless, over-sexualized, predatory women who really wanted to be men. So I think it's extremely important to preserve their stories and make them visible. And they were very invisible. When I came out to my family, I was told I was the first in the family. But how do we do that respectfully and ethically? How do we include them in an archives with lesbian in the name when they would, as the proverb goes, roll over in their graves? And I don't have an answer to that question. So I'm going to leave it hanging, and I'm going to pass the invisible microphone to Denise.
Thank you, Anne. I'm going to speak about the lesbian pulp fiction collection at Mount St. Vincent University. And sadly, it's probably one of the reasons that Anne's great aunt didn't want to be called a lesbian, because it was full of all the a lot of the stereotypes that she just talked about. Anyways, I guess it's all part of our history. Next slide. Great. So, what is lesbian pulp fiction? The books were published between the 1950s and the 1960s, and they were part of a larger, you know, pulp fiction paperback sort of fad that was going on. So, you know, along with sorry, I've sort of lost my train of thought there. The books, I mean, they're very pulpy, very much the pulp fiction genre, but they all had clearly identified lesbian characters and very sensationalized cover art. So you knew that it was lesbian stories. You have to keep in mind that pulp fiction paperbacks were very much the sort of Netflix and streaming video of their time. So really wide reach and definitely quantity over quality. Next slide, please. So who were the lesbians in lesbian pulp fiction? They were predominantly white North American and Western European women. By today's standards, the lesbian identities range from women with a fixed gender and sexual orientation to those along a continuum or in solidarity with other LGBTQ identities. It's all very complicated. So moving on to the next slide. You know, in thinking about complicated identities, who gets to determine identity and representation? And again, talking about, you know, Anne's way of viewing her identity, her great aunt's way of viewing her identity, young folks today viewing their identity, who gets to represent that? And moving on to the next slide. With lesbian pulp fiction, this was very much the corporate publishers catering to male audiences with novels authored by men. And that took up about 85% of these books. On to the next slide. But a small percentage, about 15% they believe, was queer women finding a voice. And on to the next slide. And this is really illustrated by the pulp author Mary Jane Meeker. She lived openly as a lesbian at that time, and she is still alive today. And today she's probably better known as M.E. Kerr, who's an author of young adult fiction. But back at the time when she was penning lesbian pulp fiction, she had been told by her publishers, because the books had to pass censors, it could not have a happy ending or have any ending that even hinted at the approval of homosexuality. Next slide. So In 1955, she writes a book. She's sort of commissioned to write sensationalized stories about lesbian culture in New York. And it's all very sensationalized. A little quote here: the masculine, aggressive lesbian gets a brush cut, buys a sports jacket and a necktie, and becomes the stereotype butch. Next slide. So in 1957, 2 years later, The Ladder, which was a lesbian magazine that mailed out its subscribers in plain brown paper to sort of not be caught by censors, had a review of this, and they very much criticized Mary Jane Meeker's depiction of lesbians in her book. Next slide. So the saga continues because over the next couple of years, 1958, 1960, 1963, Meeker continues to publish additional books under the Aldrich name, continuing to provide sensationalized depictions of white New York City lesbian culture and lampooning the publication ladder, actually calling them out by name. The Ladder, naturally responded with reviews and opinion pieces accusing Aldrich of self-hatred. So what might have been a 10-minute flame war on Twitter in 2022 played out over a decade in the mid-1950s. Martin Meeker, in a 2005 article, calls this one of the first documented examples of representational politics in lesbian communities. As a lesbian pulp fiction author and a lesbian proto-activist magazine fought publicly about who gets to define lesbian visibility. This strikes many people today as both quaint and very familiar, but when it comes to identity, representation, and visibility, it's never simple. So I hope that this kind of piques your interest about lesbian pulp fiction. This is a photo of it in the library. You can see that it's right next to our main desk. It's behind a cabinet, mostly to protect it, and it's for in-library use. Next slide. We also have an online exhibit to accompany it, and where available, we have included those reviews from the Ladder magazine. So you get a little back and forth between the books and how it was being received by a lesbian publication of the day. Next slide. So that's it for me. Thank you for listening, and moving on to Meredith.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to be presenting. Could I just have my slides, please? There we go. Perfect. So today I'm presenting on behalf of the Queer Heritage Initiative of New Brunswick. Next slide, please. So QHINB's collection is held at the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick, where I work as a private sector archivist. Our collection now contains around 16 sous-fonds or sub-collections, and it's continually growing. Today I wanted to focus on two collections that were donated a few years ago by members of the lesbian community. But as I'd like to just point out to or draw attention to what Rachel said, like the LGBT Seniors Archive in Nova Scotia, when they started, there was a gap in archival holdings. And I would say the same is true. So while we do have a few collections and that relate to lesbian history, lesbian activism in New Brunswick, there's still more to be done. And I think that their oral history program that they've put in place will help really help meets that gap and fills that gap, and that will be something that we are looking to do in the future. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk about Diane Douaron's collection first. So Diane is from is an Acadienne from Point Sapin, New Brunswick. It's a small area in I believe it's Northumberland County, so close to the Miramichi. In between the Miramichi and Bathurst. Diane joined the Canadian Royal Navy at the age of 20 in 1985 and was sent to HMCS Shelburne in Nova Scotia, where she was involved with the US Navy, and they were doing a special operation tracking Soviet submarines. Diane was dismissed on December 23rd of 1987 on the basis of her sexuality and after months of being interrogated about her sexuality. She had a 1-month stay before her dismissal in a psychiatric ward at CFB Halifax. Could I have the next slide, please? But was checked into a civilian hospital beforehand, and one of the items in her collection pertains to this hospital visit, and it is her bracelet from her time at the hospital. Diane was actively involved with the statement of apology to the LGBTQ plus people of Canada for their treatment during the purge from the civil service and from the armed forces. Next slide, please. Another collection that we received in 2019 was Dr. Janet Hammock. Dr. Hammock was a professor of music at Mount Allison University from 1975 to 2001, and originally was from Vancouver. In her retirement, Dr. Hammock began working with her friend, the Reverend Eldon Hay, who was a United Church minister, and took over the Sackville and Amherst chapter of PFLAG, or Parents and Friends of Gays and Lesbians, or Lesbians and Gays, and was the chapter president from 2003 until 2015. Next slide, please. Dr. Hammock was involved with the and submitted, along with Reverend Hay, submission to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. There was a hearing held in Sussex, New Brunswick. There were several hearings held across Canada as part of a discussion paper by the Department of Justice on marriage and legal recognition of same-sex unions in 2003. And we have a draft of the paper that Dr. Hammock wrote along with Reverend Hay. Dr. Hammock was also involved in writing numerous articles and letters to the editor. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so her public opinion pieces appear in New Brunswick papers from that time, and we have some of her letters and speeches in our holdings too. She was quoted in the Sackville Tribune Post 10 years ago in 2012 when speaking about a rainbow flag raising, that the rainbow flag is a celebration of us and a victory, said Hammock. For many of us, what this really means is that in today's world, we have the right to love the person we love openly, joyously, and in a committed relationship. Dr. Hammock still lives in Sackville with her partner, Marilyn. Next slide. And so, of course, there, and this sort of ties in with Anne's section and also Denise as well, but there is research needed on stories that we have been told or have been passed down. One such story that is New Brunswick related and appears in Any Other Way, How Toronto Got Queer, and in a small piece by Kate Zeman, features photos that were donated to the archives, or what was formerly known as the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives in Toronto. The photos featuring Thelma Ted Clark, who was originally from Mactaquac, a community just outside of Fredericton, are in the archives holdings. And they document Ted's relationship with their partner, Queenie. Next slide. In going through different, and I'd like to just take a minute to thank Isabel Carnegie of Ryerson University for helping to bring this story to my attention. And in going through a number of different newspaper articles from the time period from the 1950s, it appears that Ted and Queenie visited Ted's parents several times. And visited New Brunswick on a tour and stayed with Ted's parents. This is a picture of Ted from around that time period. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to wrap up and pass things over to Eleanor, but I just wanted to say if anyone has any questions, I know this was a brief overview of a couple things that we have in our collection, but if folks are interested, please reach out to us at newbrunswickqi@gmail.com. All right, over to Eleanor. Thank you.
I think you're
Eleanor,
muted.
you're on mute. There we go. You'd think after 2 years I would have that figured out. I'm going to vamp a little bit while the production team is getting my slides up. So I'll be talking, my slides are going to look very general and about how public libraries can support 2S LGBT community and visibility and how much representation matters. I'll be talking more specifically about lesbians, girls, women, and folks assigned female at birth. So the public library has a unique position in communities, and we have contact with folks at all stages of their lives, from basically from birth all the way through seniors. So we see families and kids and teens, new adults, and seniors. And so we have an opportunity to model inclusivity and lift up underrepresented voices throughout a person's life. Next slide, please. So I'll be touching on what we like some of the spheres of influence, including programming, community engagement, collections, and access to resources, and how important it is for us to make sure that lesbians and women and girls and AFAB folks get their voices lifted up. Next slide. So in terms of programming, it's important as a public library to set priorities as an organization. So Halifax Public Libraries has set those priorities by developing portfolios that include 2S LGBTQIA+, African Nova Scotian, Indigenous, newcomer services, climate action, and other pieces. So I approach it by exploring the intersectionality of a lot of these groups and through the program choices, and a commitment to program for queer community throughout the year and not just for celebrations or special days. So we've been delighted to hold a lot of book launches, author readings, and we'll continue to do so, and especially highlighting female queer community. There's a Virginia Woolf quote that I enjoy that says, "For most of history, Anonymous was a woman." So, you know, naming and uplifting is part of the work that a public library can do. Next slide. Just a few of our lovely recent launches, including Rebecca Rose in November 2019 with her book Before the Parade, Bear Bergman, who we hosted at the end of March, and who was one of the co-founders of the very first GSA in North America. And of course, Meredith Batt and Dusty Green's recent book, Len and Cub, where we had a lovely launch just last week. Next slide. So in terms of extending that to family and from getting at that young age, it's really important at this stage that people are represented and families of all types are represented. And the reason for that is that it makes somebody feel like they're part of society, and it reinforces positive views of themselves and also gives them an idea of what they can achieve. So it's also important for a public library to reflect their community and make sure that their staff also is welcoming and inclusive. If you don't see yourself in a role, you know, or someone like you in a role, it is hard to see yourself in that. I like to give the example, not necessarily like lesbian related, but Whoopi Goldberg, when she was a kid, saw Nichelle Nichols on Star Trek, and you know, that was the first time she had seen a Black woman in a role on TV, and that woman was not a maid or a servant, and it gave her the inspiration that she could do something similar. So that is kind of one of the things that inclusive children's programming can accomplish at the library, especially for girls, where you know, cisgender heteronormativity kind of is the dominant culture, and you know, if you don't like boys, we don't really have any other options to look to. There's nothing to explore. And anecdotally, I know a lot of women in their 30s and 40s who have come out in the last few years because, you know what, they didn't realize that thinking about kissing their best friend's lips wasn't straight. Next slide. And just some little fun things that we have done in the past. Also at the beginning of April, we had a lovely book launch with the authors of The Pink Balloon, which is an inclusive, a really lovely inclusive children's book. And that's the display the staff put together at Cash and Goodman. And then, of course, we've got some drag queen story time at Halifax North. Rush Vital usually brings Elle Michaels, who is a Two-Spirit Mi'kmaq community member. Next slide. Community engagement is super important when thinking about lifting up underrepresented voices. And this slide just shows a few of our more recent and past kind of partnerships. Our partnership also includes support of the Nova Scotia LGBT Seniors Archive, and it has been a delight to work with everybody over the past year and a half. And again, this kind of shows the intersectional approach that we try to take with programming. The other piece is that we can, as a library system, we can also amplify the voices of grassroots organizations and more marginalized or underrepresented communities. We have a large reach through our social media, through our website, and our can be a trusted partner. And it's really important that we do work with our community organizations because we still are facing a lot of discrimination and bigotry in our communities when we uplift voices that are underrepresented. In my district, there is a junior high who recently won a grant from NSTU to buy more 2S LGBTQIA+ books for their library. They tweeted about it, and they got so much hate from that tweet that they took it down. Staff supported that resource teacher by letting me and their supervisors know. They came up with ideas to reach out to the GSA support teacher to give him more resources and support and the staff also decided that they were going to create inclusive displays for all ages. Since this happened around Valentine's Day, there was an inclusive love display up, I think, for every age group in the library. Since then, I've received 2 written complaints from community members about the inappropriateness of those displays, despite them just showcasing families and people who are different from our dominant culture. Local church was also really badly vandalized last month because they flew a pride flag. And the same community also wrote, I also received complaint about the Ramadan Mubarak sign we had on display in that branch. Because we didn't also have the accompanying Happy Easter or, Passover signage. So connecting organizations that support youth to this community is super important and is one of my focuses right now, because I can't imagine how isolated queer youth are feeling out there. Next slide, please. I'll talk briefly about, this is some of our community involvement. I ran our Pride Parade participation pre-pandemic, and I managed to persuade our marketing and communications team to build, the first year to build a unicorn costume for the van. Next slide, please. And staff love participating in community events. It's important for us to be visible at community events as a public library. It demonstrates broadly that we welcome queer community and want to support them. So next slide. Collections. Yeah, this of course is the core and the backbone of public library work in many ways. So over the past several years, the collections department has been working at really improving our collections of all types for lesbian, gay, trans, so many subject areas. We have a fantastic collection building. The collections manager and I are also planning to launch a project this year where we build a team to update our cataloging language because it is severely out of date and in some cases is quite offensive. And we also work to provide display materials, book lists, and all that kind of support for staff to build their own in-branch displays to make their own individual spaces welcoming to queer community. In fact, if you check on our website today, there is a YA book list for Lesbian Day Visibility. The other piece, of course, is that 2S LGBTQIA books are often the most challenged, banned, removed from libraries. And as you know, there is a huge movement in our neighbors to the south right now that is drifting up into Canada as well, where conservatives are asking for books concerning anything to us LGBTQIA+ or concerning critical race theory be pulled from school libraries, curriculum, etc. I really appreciate the response from New York Public Library and Brooklyn Public Library about that. Next slide, please. And that, more displays. Sorry, next slide. Too many slides. The New York Public Library has worked with publishers to ensure that some important works are always accessible if you have one of their library cards. And the Brooklyn Public Library, which is one of the 3 independent systems that kind of serve that area. So there's New York Public Library, Queens, and Brooklyn. You can link your BPL card to an NYPL card, but the Brooklyn Public Library is has basically announced that any teenager in America can now get a Brooklyn Public Library card so that they can access banned books no matter where they are. So if their school system has pulled them, they can still access them, which I think is delightful. The New York Public Library has these 4 titles as always available, which I think is also fantastic. So that is part of the role that a public library can play in supporting queer community. And in particular, lesbians and women and people assigned female at birth. And that is the end. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass this over to Jackie, I believe, who will be managing the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you to all of our panelists for your insightful comments around issues of visibility and why visibility matters. So in the time remaining, we're going to go into the Q&A session, and the first question I have is for Denise. And so again, I would ask that people please direct your questions to a specific speaker where possible, but let's start with Denise. So in the presentation, you said that about 15% of lesbian pulp fiction novels reflected lesbian voices. Is that also true of the MSVU lesbian pulp fiction collection, and why?
So yes, our collection sort of is a slice of what was available during that time period. So there is a lot of, and I would say it kind of mirrors the 80 to 20%. Part of that's because it's a research collection, and there is value in being able to see how different the stories are when they're they're written by men for a male audience and compare them with the books that were being written by women hoping to reach their own community. Of course, I mean, there's a lot of interest in the stories that represent women, and this is my little pitch that if anyone has these books and would like to donate them to the collection so that we can continue to build that, we would definitely welcome them.
Great, thank you very much, Denise. So, so it is true then, unfortunately, that the vast majority of the books in the collection are written for and presumably for a male audience, but that is not to say that those who have them hiding away in their basements or attics, that they are not valuable. They are certainly valuable to the growing collection at Mount St. Vincent University. So you can contact Denise at the Mount, Denise Rodriguez at msvu.ca. I have a question now for Anne, and this is coming from your presentation around language. And so the question for Anne is essentially, from your perspective, how do we preserve archival materials from seniors we would label as LGBT who do not necessarily share that language?
That is exactly the question I asked. And I'm thinking about it because I don't really have an answer. I guess as far as I've gone is that I think we need to find ways to preserve and catalog each generation under its own terminology. So for people older than myself, I think we do need to put terms like career girl and not the marrying kind and great and good friends into our collections. Just as for people younger than myself, you know, we put 2S LGBTQ and we put queer, and I think each generation has its own terminology, and we need to find ways to include them all. I'm certainly not suggesting that we not put this material into collections that we label LGBTQ, but that's as far as I have come with that question.
Thank you for that, Anne. We have a question for Rachel. Is the Lesbian Oral History Project still looking for lesbians to be interviewed?
At this time, we have completed collection on the interview process as far as I'm aware. I don't think that we have any interviewers who are still, or any interviews lined up that are still in process, and we're not currently looking for any more participants, unfortunately. We had a finite amount of grant funding for this project and the hours are just done. So at this point, we don't have the resources to take any more. I don't know if the archive is planning to continue to accept that kind of material in the future, just because I'm no longer with the archive, but that would be something, if you're looking to donate this kind of material or any kind of materials, the best place to reach out would be to reach out to the archive directly, and their email address is nslgbtsa@dal.ca.
Great, thanks very much for that, Rachel. Meredith, I have sort of a follow-up question for you regarding you've been doing the travel around the Atlantic and elsewhere with your new book and your book launch, and I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about next events for you. So in terms of either the Lennon Cub book or in terms of the work that's happening with the archival work that you're doing. Thanks.
Thanks, Jackie. That's a great question. So the Lennon, we've been amazed by the response that people have had to Lennon Cub, and I think then that's why I showed the photos of Ted and Queenie, because it's stories like that and looking at our past that we really need to draw out for our understanding of the past. And also like as educational examples too for our current time. But the Lennon Cub book has been touring around the Maritimes, as you mentioned. We have an artist talk coming up next Thursday, May 5th, at the Beaverbrook Art Gallery in Fredericton. But then we were also doing book tours in mid-May, May 13th, at the St. John Arts Centre in St. John, and July 4th at Resurgo Place in Moncton. So we are working away on different things. But for QHINB, we have several things in the works right now for summer programming. We're hoping to do an intergenerational panel. I unfortunately didn't have time in my presentation to get into any of our oral history work, which I have in the past, but we also have a collection of oral history interviews. So if you're interested in consulting our holdings, you can either reach out to us at the email I provided, so New Brunswick QI@gmail.com, or if you go to the Council of Archives New Brunswick, I'll pop the link in the chat. That's where our finding aids are held, and so you can browse through the material that way. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Meredith, for that. We have, I think, time for one more question, and this question is for Anne. So Anne, the question is, how did you convince lesbians to open up about their stories, and did you do personal outreach?
I'm not sure what the context of that question is, since I have not done any recording of oral histories or anything.
So in terms of having conversations with your great aunt, for example, or others, how did you have conversations? Again, this is, I think the question is meant to get at how people internalize certain labels and reject other labels. So how did you have that conversation with your relatives about their identity, or their relationships rather?
Yes, and it's in this case, it's not just my aunt and my great aunt, both of whom are now gone, but my partner and I volunteer in a continuing care home. And over the years, we've come across a number of women who clearly live their lives among women. We certainly don't use our language. We just, ask the kinds of questions and listen. Talk about, follow their lead. You were a career girl. Where did you work? What did you do with your time? Did you have a good circle of friends? Like, just the kind of questions you ask, right? And so it doesn't ever come out directly, but you're constantly reading between the lines.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that. We're just about out of time. I see that the archives email has been put in the chat. So for those of you who wish to donate to the archive or get other information about the archive, please use that address that's in the chat. And I just wanted to, by way of wrap up, offer a final thank you. And so I'd once again like to express my sincere and deep gratitude to our panelists for their thoughts on the issue of lesbian visibility as we mark International Lesbian Visibility Day 2022. Thank you to Rachel, Anne, Denise, Meredith, and Eleanor. It was a really important conversation, particularly thinking of some of the comments that Eleanor made about the steady erosion of people's fundamental human rights, and particularly those of us from from LGBT communities. And so I hope that we can do this again. Perhaps we can do this in October in recognition of LGBT History Month, which will be coming up sooner than we imagine in October. Thank you to our brilliant production team from Dalhousie University. In particular, big shout out to Marlo, Jolene, Courtney, Nicole, Phil, and Guy. Thank you to our audience for joining us today for this panel discussion on the importance of lesbian visibility. And just to note in closing that the recording from this event will be available in the next few days on the NS-LGBT Seniors Archive website. And again, I think the link is now in the chat. And so again, thank you to all of you for being here and joining us today. And thank you again to our wonderful panelists. Thank you.